Okay, welcome everybody to Insurance Benefits for Members. It's 5 after 8 and I think we'll get started now, so I'll turn the presentation over to Michael King from Intercity Insurance.
Okay, thanks Kerry. Good evening everybody. As Kerry said, my name is Mike King, and for those of you I haven't met, insurance group, and I've been providing the insurance benefit program to NBEA and indeed most of the other provincial sport organizations across Canada for somewhere between 10 and 15 years, depending on the organization. What we've done over time is develop a host of insurance products that are unique to the horse. And very deep background from myself. I am a horseman. I've run a barn. I've taught lessons. I've judged horse shows. I've owned horses and bred horses. Lived on a farm for a good chunk of my life, although I don't anymore. But so I do have a sense of the industry, and I've been working in the horse insurance industry for 22 years. So these benefits that we provide, or these insurance components we provide, come from a position of knowledge in our own lives, but also from the experience of your membership in the NBEA and people like you across the country. And indeed, at this moment, we're probably insuring 60 to 70,000 folks like you who have horses in some capacity as part of your lifestyle. And that obviously includes everyone from the professional coach to the individual horse owner to the person who has chosen a purely recreational sort of avenue with horses and has done riding lessons or decides to do trail riding in the summer just as an activity. But these insurance components were really designed to try and embrace as many of those activities as we could, as often as we could, so that people could take some solace in having the appropriate coverage. There really is a benefit of being a member, and I'll start by speaking to the various components that are included in the membership. Then we'll talk about some of the other optional things that you can purchase if you so choose, and obviously they are exactly that, optional. And then, as Kerry has told me before we went live tonight, there's already been some email questions that have come into Kerry, and some of those questions will be addressed through the presentation. I will do my best to go back to those written questions and make sure that they are fully addressed after the slides have run their course. But now I'll encourage you to send emails to Kerry during the course of the presentation if there are questions that arise from the things that I'm about to talk about. And Kerry, I will happily be quiet for a moment. If people need to know what the email address is, they should send the questions to. Okay, so let's assume that there's a way for you guys to do that. I'll also tell you what my email address is now and do so at the end of the presentation as well. So if there are questions that can't be addressed in this presentation and you'd like to have a more personal conversation with me, you're welcome to do so. My email address is mking@intercityinsurance.com, and I'll happily respond to you at an appropriate time. And again, I'll give that email address again at the end. So without further ado, here are the things that we do. And the first thing that we do, and when I say we do, I mean to say that these are the two insurance components that are automatically provided to you as soon as you are deemed to be a member in good standing of the NBEA. So as soon as you have paid your membership dues for the calendar year, they have been accepted and your membership is deemed to be in good standing, and for as long as that status is in place, then these two insurance components are automatically provided to you. The coverage in both of these cases is in force 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and indeed covers you anywhere in the world. So for any of you that are listening that travel to the United States to horse show, or to Quebec to horse show, or are fortunate enough to be involved in an equine activity outside of North America, it matters not. These two policies actually follow you anywhere in the world. And I want to discern right away that what we're providing insurance to is you. We don't insure your horse under this, we insure you. And we insure you first for liability that might be imposed upon you as the owner of a horse. Or a lessee of a horse, or a user of a horse, but in all cases we're covering the liability that can be imposed upon you in a court of law because you own, lease, or are using the horse, or indeed are in its care, custody, and control, and it causes bodily injury or property damage to someone else or something else. And the greatest, easiest example is the horse kicks someone else. They decide to sue you for their injury. This policy responds. Your horse kicks a car, and the owner of the car takes exception to that for some reason and decides to sue you. This policy will respond. Your horse escapes onto the roadway and is struck by a car, which regrettably is an annual event somewhere in the country. This policy will respond. And by respond, I mean to say that the insurance company is obliged in the contract to respond to a claim that is made against you, whether you are guilty or not, and provide a defense, whether you are guilty or not, and make a payment on your behalf up to a maximum of $5 million if deemed to be negligent, and the damages awarded by the court are such that the policy needs to respond. It is the insurance company's money. They deem how it is spent. They decide when the claim is settled, if it is going to be. And I assure you, after all of these years, that the policy has had ample opportunity to respond and to prove itself as being a very valuable asset. And for those that don't think that there's any value in having liability insurance, I would encourage you to consider the cost of membership and compare that to the cost of retaining a lawyer who will respond on your behalf free or not free, and that really is the case, and to be writing a check up to $5 million. And indeed, I suspect that that retainer alone would be far in excess of the annual membership that you're being asked to pay to the NBEA. So it is really quite inclusive. We don't care how many horses you own, and that's another thing that often comes up. This is not, again, being provided on a per-horse basis. It is being provided on a per-member basis. Individuals who are juniors, meaning under the age of majority, indeed who are members and own horses, should have, well, indeed will have this coverage provided to them automatically. If the member of the NBEA is a junior, and this is an important note, for all those parents who may have children involved in equine activity, myself being one of them at one point, suffice to say that if the member is a junior and the junior owns the horse because of the passporting or whatever, and a claim arises where that horse that is owned by the junior is involved, I want the parents to understand that in fact this policy will respond for the junior member in their own right, and indeed on behalf of the parents automatically, because they are the parents of the junior member who is indeed the owner of the horse. So that's an important element. We sometimes are asked if, you know, if my daughter's the rider and the horse person in the family, and I bought her a horse and so forth, and I put it in her name as dad, do I as the dad have to join the NBEA? And the answer is no, not to obtain protection under this policy. So that's the liability policy in a nutshell, and there are obviously some other nuances that arise from it. But the gist of it is that it's $5 million of coverage. It doesn't matter how many horses you own. It doesn't matter how many claims arise, because there is no aggregate, as we call it in our industry. So if it were a tragic year and we had multiple $5 million claims across the program in New Brunswick, or indeed across Canada, Lloyd's of London, who is the insuring company providing coverage, would pay any multiple as required in law to pay of $5 million for each occurrence. And that's an important element as well. The second element is the $30,000 accident, death, and dismemberment policies for catastrophic injuries arising from interaction with horses. And again, this is for the member of the NBEA. This is an automatic benefit that is provided. And it's important to know how AD&D policies work. I want everyone to understand this because these questions come up frequently. This policy is intended to provide some compensation for specific injuries or death that arise from an equine-related accident. It is not going to pay $30,000 for a broken arm. We sometimes get people perceive that when they see $30,000, it doesn't matter what the injury is or what the circumstances are, that they're going to get $30,000, and that's not how it works. AD&D policies are expressed as a principal sum, which is what that $30,000 limit is, and depending on what injury or what circumstance, if it were death that was being claimed, it is either a multiple of 30,000 or indeed a portion of 30,000. So it does depend on what the injury is. I'll give you an example. It's if there was a paraplegic outcome from an accident involving a horse, it's actually 2 times the principal sum, so it's $60,000. If it's death, it's $30,000. If it's something like a broken back or loss of use of a single limb or loss of sight or loss of hearing, it is a part of 30,000. I can't recall the entire schedule, but suffice to say that it does depend on what the injury is. It is enforced 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but it is only related to an interaction with a horse. So we had one actually not that long ago, a very serious incident where someone was traveling. They were on vacation down south. They had gone trail riding at a public facility and fell off and were catastrophically injured. And indeed, this policy responded and wrote a check. So there is a schedule or a list of injuries, and depending on what the injury is, it will be a part of or a multiple of that $30,000. This policy does not have any transfer rights, so it's if there were a death, and this is again a question that comes up, I apologize in advance for some of the gruesome parts of this, but it is what it is. We can't make a beneficiary in the death portion. We sometimes get asked about that. And the answer is we can't. The death benefit, if it were to be called upon, would be paid automatically to the estate of the deceased person, and it would then be up to the estate itself to determine who the benefactor would be of the estate, where this amount of money would simply be a part of that total estate. So we can't designate a beneficiary. In addition to the catastrophic injury single lump sum payment, there are other extensions that arise or that are part of it, of the policy. Things like expenses that might arise if someone had to make modifications to their home as a result of a permanent injury and so on. There's some retraining benefits and other things that are on top of the $30,000 principal sum benefit. And again, we hope that none of you ever have to call upon it, but if you do, then at least it's something that's there. So I want to go back to the liability part because frankly that's our liability discussion, just because that's the part that seems to come up more often than not. And there's some definitions that you see on the screen that speak to the difference between commercial liability or indeed personal liability. And there is a very real difference in law and indeed in the wordings that arise from insurance policies. And I'll give a good example or an example that might put this in context. Your home insurance policy is a personal liability policy, or if you have a tenants package. It is a wording that was designed, gosh, I don't know how long ago, that recognizes that each of us in our respective occupancy of residences, whether it be a tenanted place or an owned place, we might have a dog, we might invite people over to have dinner, we might have a barbecue and invite neighbors over, all those things that are personal in nature. And indeed there is a liability component typically provided by that policy. Conversely, my business, Intercity Insurance Services, we occupy space to run my business, and obviously there is a commercial, this is a commercial enterprise, so I have a commercial liability policy. In the horse industry, a boarding place would be deemed a commercial facility, and so it's critically important that facilities that are operating boarding operations or have boarding operations on their farm have a commercial liability cover for their activities. A riding coach, another good example where if I'm teaching so-and-so how to ride and so-and-so is paying me to do that, then to cover myself, I really do need a commercial liability policy so that the wording recognizes that there is compensation. And the reason that there's a difference in these two wordings, frankly, is that the courts have deemed many decades ago that when people enter into a commercial transaction, they have certain expectations that need to be met. And if someone enters your farm as a riding student or as a boarder, they have legal rights that are very different than someone who is coming to your property as an invited guest to have supper. And the commercial client, who may not have any knowledge of you per se, but knows your business, would have an expectation to be kept safe while they were there receiving the service that you are charging them money for. And that's actually the underlying element here, is that you're charging money for the provision of the service, to which you've raised the bar. And people have every right to expect to be safe while they pay you money to do whatever it is you do to provide the service to them. The personal liability policy that I provide through the membership is indeed personal. It is not commercial. So for those of you that may think that this policy that we provide you through your membership automatically in the NBEA provides you coverage for a boarding place or a riding school, the answer is it does not. You need to have a commercial general liability policy that is designed specifically to address your commercial enterprise. They are not particularly expensive, different wordings. There's certainly more money than the personal liability policy is charged for, but it obviously has a much broader scope in terms of what it does, and frankly is probably more likely to be called upon because, again, the courts have deemed years and years ago that a commercial transaction, there's an expectation level that people have, and so if that expectation is not met, there are certain rights that can be exercised, and that very well may involve having to sue you. So that's something that's important. Excess is written here on purpose. It is important to note that the personal liability policy that's provided to membership in the NBEA is deemed to be an excess policy, which means to say that if there is other insurance that can be called upon, that the insuring company, Lloyd's of London, will indeed call upon it to respond first to whatever the circumstance is. If there is no other policy that could or should respond, then of course this policy drops down, as we call it, and becomes primary, first responder, and will pick up the bill entirely. But if there is other underlying insurance that can or should respond to a specific circumstance, then of course that policy will be called upon first. And the example might be the horse that, I don't know, the horse that escapes from the paddock onto the highway, and there's a lawsuit. And let's assume that the farm owner has $2 million of coverage for the ownership of their farm. And the policy also has some recognition that there are horses on the property, which we would expect. But let's say the horse causes an accident on the highway. The lawsuit is $4 million. And I'm obviously making up numbers for the sake of doing it. The farm property policy would be called upon first as primary. When that limit was exhausted, let's assume it was a $1 or $2 million limit, then the NBEA policy would respond for the balance so that the full claim was paid. Conversely, someone doesn't own property, and we do have lots of folks that don't. They don't have any other personal liability insurance in their life that would respond to ownership of a horse, then the NBEA policy would pay from $1. So this excess clause, as we call it, is very common in insurance. In fact, most home insurance policies have exactly the same wording. And it's a way for the insurance companies to share the risk, as it were, with any other insurer that they may or may not know about at the time. And it really does depend entirely on the circumstance to see how those orders of payments would occur. As I say, this is a little bit out of order, and we sort of addressed some of this. I suppose this last paragraph is important in the conversation, and that is to say that there is no benefit for fracture or dental injuries that arises from the $30,000 automatic coverage. However, the other thing that was not noted until now is that it does include injuries that might be sustained while traveling to and from an equine event. And that could be as simple as you having a traffic accident on the way to your riding lesson. If it left you in a very serious injury circumstance, then this policy would have an obligation to respond. So that's more about the AD&D, and it's important. All right, so once we get past those automatic coverages, the two policies, the $5 million personal liability and $30,000 accident, death, and dismemberment policies, then there are some other programs that we've added over the years. 2009 or 10, I think we introduced this in some provinces. And to be frank, I don't remember exactly when NBEA bought in. But we were getting some folks that were trying to, or were necessarily asking for more coverage for their equine-related activities. And so we made an offer to increase that limit, but did it optionally. So you can actually enhance that AD&D coverage that you have by an additional $50,000 for the principal sum for those permanent and serious catastrophic injuries. So ultimately, with $30,000, you'd have $80,000 if there were a death arising from an equine-related accident. But in addition to those principal sums being increased, you would also then be provided the benefit of having a fracture benefit. So if there were some sort of a broken bone arising from falling off a horse, perhaps, or being kicked by a horse, then there would be a benefit paid. Now, you can see here that the benefits paid are quite specific for fracture. I want to say clearly here that as much as there is a $50,000 principal sum for the catastrophic and permanent injuries, there is a sublimit for fracture, which has a principal sum of $1,500 if you're wearing a helmet, or $750 if you are not wearing a helmet. And this is related to fracture only. And if there were a fracture, then again, like the other policies, the principal sum becomes the first starting point. And indeed, broken femurs, broken legs, broken arms would pay a portion of that $1,500. What's important to note here is that you can see that there's a very real difference in the amount that might be paid for a broken femur if, in fact, you were not wearing a helmet. And we are strong proponents for wearing a helmet anytime you are on or near a horse. And we can talk about all kinds of claims that we've seen over the years or incidents we've seen over the years where wearing a helmet would have either eliminated an injury altogether or minimized it or mitigated it in very innocent circumstances. And I often tell this story only because I did know this person quite well, or do know this person quite well. A young woman that we know close to the office here, summer evening, she's ridden her horse, she's had a wonderful ride, she's worn her helmet, of course, all through the lesson and all through her riding and cooling down. She's now hosed off her horse, and they're out enjoying the evening, and the horse is on grass, and she's just at the other end of the lead shank and kind of daydreaming with her horse and thinking how wonderful the day had been. Well, a fly shows up, and of course the fly bites the horse's butt. The horse turns his head very quickly, sort of comes around quickly to get the fly, catches this young woman in the head, regrettably, and blinds her permanently. And it's just where the horse caught her. And we forget sometimes how big and powerful these critters are. But the horse's head is, 150, 200 pounds. It's very bony and knobby. It's pretty hard. And, of course, it's coming around at probably 60 or 70 miles an hour when it's trying to get a fly. And it doesn't take much to appreciate how much damage it can do. Had she been wearing a helmet, the doctor made it very clear after the fact she would not have had the injury at all. She might have had a headache, but she certainly would not have lost her sight. So it just reminds us that being around horses can be equally as hazardous in some circumstances as being mounted. So we encourage coaches, frankly, to teach their kids when they start in these lesson programs that, frankly, from the time the kid gets out of the car till the time the kid gets back in the car to go home, the kid should be wearing the helmet. As crazy as that sounds, it just creates a mentality, just a safe environment, because we just never know when these accidents are going to occur. The other benefits that's provided here moving forward is a dental benefit, and again, regrettably, we do get dental injuries occasionally when horses bring their heads up quickly or people fall off and their face finds the dirt, and so there is a dental benefit that's paid. So what isn't included, again, you can read these things, but it does not include coverage for loss of income. So the person that does fall off, suffers an injury, and can't go to work, there is no coverage for that. This is a catastrophic, permanent, excuse me, not permanent, but there is a schedule of benefits, and once those benefits are paid, it's done. And there are some other associated costs associated with rehabilitation, physiotherapy, and so on. So this is a very good benefit, I must say, and a good number of members across the country do take advantage of it because it does enhance not only the principal sum amounts, as I said, 50 plus or 30 plus 50 in this case, but it also provides these fracture and dental benefits, which seem to be important to some folks. The next optional benefit that we provide, and again, the AD&D that we've just spoken about is an option. You can purchase it through the NBEA. They will eventually send me your name and address and so forth, and we send a specific certificate to you defining the coverages and when it became effective. Anyway, the second optional membership benefit we have is a horse mortality policy. And horse mortality just means the life of the animal is insured, and you can read the various causes of death that are being covered by this policy. If the horse does not die from one of these causes, it is not a claim, and we won't pay. The limit that we will pay is up to $10,000. It is not $10,000 for the $2,000 horse. If a horse should die under this program and a claim is made, then the burden of proof to define and tell us what the value of the horse was prior to its death falls entirely to you. But it is up to a maximum of $10,000 for the value of the horse. Again, many folks have seen value in this policy, which is gratifying to know that we sort of hit the nail on the head. For those folks that perhaps aren't prepared to spend a great deal of money on full mortality insurance, this might be a very good option. Again, this is not restricted to any one place or any one activity, nor is it restricted to any one horse. So if you happen to own 3 horses, you can purchase this policy, I think, for $20, and I'm trying to recall what what it is on the NBEA website, but I think it's $20 or $25 for the full year. And if you had multiple animals, and if there were a catastrophe where a number of your horses were killed as a result of one of these perils, then indeed the policy would pay up to a maximum of $10,000 for that loss. So it's not $10,000 per horse. It's although it could be if you only lost one horse, or it would be $10,000 for any one loss if you had more than one horse. And it will pay only the $10,000 will only be paid once per term per member. So, and we've never had to call upon the policy more than once through the course of a year for any one member. But certainly some folks have had the unfortunate circumstance of losing a horse to one of these perils, and again, it's a very inexpensive way to provide some coverage for your horse. So that's a very good policy. I like that one a lot, and so do a lot of folks. It does the job. It's clean, it's neat, and it's very inexpensive. Okay, sorry, we did that one. We did that one, so I'm getting out of order here. Sorry, I apologize. Guess this is the next one here. So the next policy that we have that's available as an option is tack insurance. Again, trying to address all aspects of the activity with horses. And this policy, as you can read, insures tack and equipment from any loss. So this is all risk coverage. It doesn't matter where the tack is, so it doesn't matter whether the tack is kept at your barn or at a boarding place or indeed in your basement. If it's lost, then you can rely upon this insurance policy to cover it. There is a deductible of $500, which was we meant to put that on the slide, so it wasn't necessary. It wasn't a mistake by mistake, so I apologize for that. But there is a deductible of $500. So if you lose a bit, I don't want to hear from you. However, it is very good coverage because it is so broad in scope. But what it won't cover is things like your helmet. If you leave your helmet at the barn and somebody steals it, I'm sorry, I can't help you. If it is by way of wear and tear, you know, the tack just wears out, then I'm not paying for that, nor am I paying for mysterious disappearance. We've actually had this happen where more than once, and having been a hunter rider myself, I can attest to this, where you have to strip the horse to go back into jog, and you leave your stuff at the gate because your groom's gone somewhere else, or maybe you don't have a groom and you're just doing it on your own, and you come back to the gate and your stuff's gone. That's mysterious disappearance. It's not theft unless you can show that it was a theft, and that's sometimes very hard for people to understand. But we obviously expect you to take care of your stuff, and but when bad stuff happens, if there were a theft and there was an obvious sign of forced entry into the tack room or the police were involved, then that's theft, and that of course is covered. The other thing we can't cover is horse-drawn vehicles, and this is something that Lloyd's wouldn't allow us to cover. Coverage is $5,000, and again, I don't care what the makeup of your tack is or what discipline you ride or particularly where it's kept. as long as it's intact, it's owned by you, and you can prove that you owned it and it was lost, then it's going to be covered. The last option is travel insurance. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about this, but some folks who do have the opportunity to travel, whether it's related to being involved with a horse when you are abroad, in other words, going to Florida at a horse show, or to Maine, or to somewhere else, then anywhere outside of New Brunswick, frankly, then you have the opportunity to obtain relatively inexpensive travel insurance. What is unique about this policy is simply that our policy does not exclude participating in a sport activity, where if you check with Visa or MasterCard or Blue Cross, typically the default policy that they will sell you has a very specific exclusion, meaning to say it's not covered if you participate in competitive activities or dangerous activities. And you'd be quite surprised how many people believe that what we do when we go out to play with our horses is deemed to be a dangerous activity. So it's important that if you don't choose to take advantage of this travel policy, that if you do travel outside of New Brunswick, that you make sure that you are being covered properly for the activities that you plan to participate in when you are outside of the province. And I keep saying outside of the province because it's important to note that New Brunswick as a province, just as it is here in Ontario and in Nova Scotia and the PEI, these are provincial health insurance plans. They are not federal, which means to say that when you travel outside of New Brunswick to Toronto or to Vancouver, there is no assurance that the New Brunswick health plan is going to protect you from all expenses that you might incur if you had to seek emergency medical attention in one of those provinces. And people often forget that even if you are traveling on business or traveling somewhere else outside of your home province, that you are ultimately exposed to the possibility of not having your health plan protect you for all the expenses you incur. The one thing I do want to talk about here, two things I suppose, is as you can see, I don't really care how many trips you take during the course of the year. I will cover you for any trip you take that is up to a maximum of 90 days in duration. And that's a very generous trip for most, except for those that are fortunate enough to go south for a very long period of time during the winter months. And certainly after the winter that you've all had in New Brunswick, I can imagine that next year people will be planning to leave in September perhaps and come back in June. But suffice to say that in the travel insurance world, 90 days is quite generous for any one trip. What is most critical, though, and what I really do want to speak very briefly about, is that you have to purchase the product before you leave. You can't go to Florida and then phone and say, I'm out of province, I want coverage now. It doesn't work that way. And the reason it doesn't is because the 90 days starts from the date of departure. It does not start from the day you call. And it's very important to know that. For those that are fortunate enough to get away for a really long period of time, what we have to say to them is this: if you go to Florida from November till May, you need to know that the November trip, which is going to go beyond the membership year, is still valid for 90 days from the day you left in November. However, for the next 90 days to be triggered, you need to come home. And you need to be home and show that you were home. Even if it's overnight, it doesn't matter, but you have to be back in New Brunswick and then leave again for the next 90-day period to be triggered. That's just how it works. It's true of all travel insurance. This is not unique to us, and it's important to know that. At this time of year, I mean, we're coming out of the sort of the winter travel long trip sort of thing, but it's something to remember for next year if you wanted to take advantage. The other thing is that we've got an age limit that we think is fairly generous, up to 70 years old, or 75, excuse me, that has been in place since inception. So that's all I'm going to say about the travel, because it's rather complicated, but it's a good program. So here are some questions that we hear about fairly often, and Carrie Lamb, the gentleman that introduced me at the outset, has a couple of email questions that we're going to come back to. And again, I'm hopeful that others that have been listening may have questions, and if so, they are able to ask. But let's talk about these, if I may. You can say an NBEA member is leasing a horse, they're trailering the leased horse, and they're involved in an accident. Does the third-party liability insurance cover them? As a non-owned horse, is the lessee considered the owner in this case? The answer is it would depend on what the lessee said, or the owner of the horse said. If the owner stipulated that it was a claim that they wanted to make against you, and they could show that there was responsibility in the lease contract that made you responsible for the animal, then indeed we would have to respond, and we would vehemently defend. And there is a care, custody, and control component in the policy that will pay for that incidental non-owned horse that's in your care. So the answer is yes, we would respond to that. Now, what value is this program if I have home insurance? Well, I suppose that's a reasonable question. This policy is not intended to be a panacea for everyone. I will say this, that $5 million of coverage is a fairly high limit. And indeed, if your homeowner insurance policy does provide an extension for horses, I would question in return whether or not that liability insurance coverage is comprehensive to the extent that it may recognize, or excuse me, hopefully it's broad enough to recognize that you take your horse to horse shows, for instance, or that you live in the city of St. John and indeed you board your horse out in the country. Does the homeowner insurance policy think that the horse is in the backyard? And I know that sounds a little silly and if you live in urban or suburban in a city, but the reality is that home insurers may or may not understand what we do in our industry of horses. But I would have to say that regardless, there's significant value in the program, if for no other reason to give you a very significant limit of insurance. It's not limited to any one horse. I don't care where you take the horse or what you use it for, as long as it's for personal use. And so I think there's value there. But of course, then there's the $30,000 accident insurance policy, which undoubtedly is not part of your home insurance. So if that's the only value you can see in the program, then so be it. The third one is a great question that we get asked frequently. Does the insurance policy cover the owner manager of the boarding facility? The answer is no. I'm not covering the boarding manager for his or her activity. I go back to the first comment I made in the slide presentation where we spoke about the commercial versus personal liability, and if someone's operating a boarding facility, then the boarding facility should indeed have their own insurance to cover their own business. This policy, the NBEA policy, is certainly going to cover the boarder, the owner of the horse. So again, we'll go back to the example where the boarded horse, your horse, gets out on the road and gets struck by a car from the boarding place's paddock. And so the question is, who's going to be sued? Well, the answer is both you as the owner of the horse are going to be sued, whether you're present or not. But by virtue of owning the horse, you're going to be named in the lawsuit. And indeed, the boarding facility is going to be named in the lawsuit because it's their facility that the horse escaped from. And again, this policy would respond for the NBEA member as the owner of the horse, but would have no obligation to respond for the boarding facility, who frankly should have his own policy. And indeed, the NBEA policy would be very limited in how it would respond, quite purposely, so that it's only addressing the owner's liability. The next question I think we did answer as far as the TAC, just because we're assuming, frankly, that the vast majority of TAC that is owned by NBEA members is not in the basement, although some of it might be. It's kept at a boarding place where the horse lives, and that's fine. The answer is yes, it is covered. The only thing I will speak to on that topic, if I may just for a moment, is as I travel across the country, and I do almost all year round, and travel to barns all the time, I'm always amazed at how few tack rooms are locked. And I know it's a huge challenge to keep a facility locked up for security but safe enough for people to come and go, and accessible, I should say, enough for people to come and go. But the reality is that the boarding place does have some obligation to keep the product or the property that is left behind safe. But similarly, the owner of the facility does not have an obligation to keep it safe forever. In other words, people have to know that the boarding place is not responsible if your stuff's stolen, but they could be held legally liable, I guess. But it is a bit of a challenge. My recommendation, frankly, always is to folks, if you've gone out and you spent $3,500 on a saddle, take it home. I can't imagine leaving that kind of an asset just out in the open, which indeed it very well might be at a barn. And where we do get tack thefts, I assure you the thieves do know who owns the good tack, who doesn't own the good tack, what a good saddle is, what a bad saddle is. Although many saddles are now serial numbered, the reality is that they can disappear very quickly. They're quite portable, needless to say, and although they may not fit the next horse, they can certainly be sold pretty quickly at flea markets and what have we, and so they're kind of vulnerable. So I would say if it's expensive stuff, protect it. Does the insurance program cover my horses if it is injured? And the answer is no. The only coverage that's relevant to horses is, of course, the horse mortality insurance, and mortality being the key word here. The horse needs to die, and it needs to be for one of those causes. But if it were injured, then regrettably I'm not going to cover it. Now, if it is a catastrophic injury that leads to the death of the horse from one of these insured perils, then it is going to be covered. I don't know, the horse survives the lightning strike for a few days but then dies. The answer is, of course, it's paid. So it's only relative to those things that are covered. So if I compete in the U.S. for 3 months, am I covered? It's a generic question. You're covered for liability, for sure. You're covered for accident, death, and dismemberment, for sure. If you bought the travel policy, then you are personally covered for emergency travel medical expenses you might incur for 90 days. And the horse is, of course, covered by the horse mortality because it's anywhere in North America, and the tack is covered when you're away. So again, it's certainly broad in scope. If I have travel coverage, how do I make a claim? And I'm not sure how that snuck in there, but the reality is that there are forms that need to be completed. I regret that the insurance industry is fraught with forms and paperwork. We love it. We need it. We must have it in order for claims to be paid. There is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week phone number for emergency claims that we provide to people that have purchased a travel product. And the forms are provided by the insurance company, not by us as the broker. Although if we're called upon to assist with a claim, we'll certainly do that to help make sure paperwork gets to where it needs to go. But frankly, the Privacy Act across the country makes it such that we don't get particularly involved in what the injury is, nor do we get particularly involved with how much coverage is going to be provided to you. That's up to the insurance company, and that's done to protect your privacy. So we will advocate, certainly, and we'll be here to make sure that claims go the way that they are intended to go. And if that involves getting paperwork to you more quickly, then we'll certainly do that, of course. But there is a 24-hour service that is provided to members that purchase the travel policy. So I've gone 45 minutes, which is exactly what we intended to do. It does leave some time for questions, so I do thank you in advance for doing this. I'm going to also now just quickly look and see what other questions might have come up from Carrie at the beginning, and one of them speaks to whether or not, so this particular member has two donkeys and a 10-month-old colt, as well as a mature horse, I'm guessing. The answer, and the question is, does my insurance cover that? Well, yes, it does. We do have members that we recognize might have donkeys in their life. The policy does say equine. It's not horse-specific. We sometimes get asked whether minis are covered, and of course they are horses by definition, so we do cover them. Further down on the same question, they talk about whether we also have 3 boarded horses at our barn. Should I be purchasing some type of barn insurance? And the answer is yes, you should, because there is commercial exposure that needs to be addressed specifically by a commercial liability policy. If the owners of the boarders have paid their NBEA memberships, are their horses covered while in my barn? The answer is yes. Boarded horses, or indeed NBEA members who board their horses, have liability insurance that will protect their ownership of the horse 24/7 anywhere on the planet. So if, again, that boarded horse who is owned by an NBEA member causes injury to someone else or property damage to something else, and the owner of the horse is sued, then the policy will pay. Again, same person saying, my newly acquired mare kicked one of the boarded horses, another boarded horse I presume, and after having the vet come to check their horse out, everything was fine, but if she had done some real damage to the other horse, is there any special insurance I should be carrying? And I presume I is the person who owns the boarding facility. The answer is yes, there is. Again, under the commercial liability policies that would be provided properly to a boarding facility, there is a part of the policy that addresses specifically the care, custody, and control of non-owned horses, i.e. boarders. And that's where that policy would need to respond to if the owner of the injured horse sued the boarding place manager because of the injury sustained. If the owner of the injured horse decided to also name the NBEA member, this other person who owns the horse that kicked the horse, as it were. I know that all sounds a bit confusing, but I think you all get it. The answer is the NBEA policy would respond for the owner of the horse, and then the commercial liability insurer for the boarding facility would respond for the boarding facility manager. All right, so that's that. Let's see what else we got here. I've been told I can put my horse on my homeowner's insurance. Is this different from NBEA? Yes, it is, I guess. And again, we did speak to that earlier about the difference perhaps between a homeowner's insurance policy and the intent of it, and what the NBEA policy is designed specifically to do, and whether or not they augment each other or one is better than the other. Again, without looking at the homeowner's insurance policy wording, I can't make really any comment here. But suffice to say that we recognize that certainly many of the NBEA members, or indeed members of any provincial organization such as NBEA across the country, may well have other insurance that could or should respond to a claim. But again, without knowing what that claim is, it's impossible to know what restrictions or limitations might be imposed upon the owner of the homeowner's insurance policy. What I can tell you is about my policy, and can tell you with some certainty that in fact it's quite broad in scope, and although there may be some investigation to find out whether or not your homeowner insurance should be responding or not, the reality is that either way I'm coming to the party. So that's perhaps the security and the insurance, and that's really what it's intended to do. The last question that I see here is, what about operating horse shows? Does the NBEA policy respond? And the answer is no. Again, people that organize and operate horse events, whether it be a clinic or a horse show, or indeed a riding lesson circumstance, or trail rides, or teamster rides, or carriage rides, they need to have a commercial liability policy to cover those things. They're very different from a personal liability exposure. They're very different from a personal liability wording. And so the answer is no. You need a very special policy for that. It doesn't have to be overly expensive, guys, and you need to understand that. You know, just because it's commercial doesn't mean it's horrendously expensive. Commercial liability insurers who are interested in participating in the business of horses, including our businesses that we run across the country, have found insuring companies that keep the policies economically appropriate. Are you going to pay more than you would for a personal liability policy? Yes, but the presumption is that you're gaining some income from that business transaction, and it's a business expense. It's just part of the deal, and more and more insurers are participating in that space, and so it's not impossible to find. Does an equine event cover riding lessons? I'm not sure really what that means.
The travel to and from an equine event clause, Mike.
I'm sorry, say again, Kerry?
That was the clause that had you're covered on travel to or from an equine event.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. So if you were injured while traveling to a riding lesson, if that's the question, then the answer is yes, it does cover that. Specifically, in fact, it's something that we built into the policy, and it is covered. The next question, I think, which may be the last one, is there a time limit on submitting a claim? The answer is yes, there is. There's due diligence here that needs to be done by the insurance company if there's a claim, and they can't do it if people don't tell us about the incident. A very common one is someone who suffers a dental injury and doesn't tell us for 8 months that they want to have some coverage because somehow the claim's gone sideways, or somehow the injury's gone sideways. The insurance companies say, no, that's no good. We need to know within a reasonable period of time. In fact, for dental injuries, I want to say it's 30 days. Whether or not there's a claim, if people suffer serious injuries as a result of being around horses or involved in an equine activity, it's a simple phone call to me. It's a case of saying, hi, it's Susie Smith. My daughter had a wreck, I had a wreck. Somebody, I'm at least letting you know that in fact this may lead to a claim. That's all you have to do. Now, I don't want to hear from folks as much as I love speaking on the phone, as some will attest to. The reality is for things that are relatively minor that you know are going to be okay, then I don't need to know about that. But if someone loses a tooth and they've got the fracture and dental benefit, they've purchased the optional AD&D, and they know that there's a reasonable possibility of there being a claim coming up, then I want you to let me know. You don't have to make the claim today, but you need to let me know that things happen. I say the same thing to coaches all the time. Kids fall off in lessons all the time. The question always arises, do I need to let my insurer know if the kid falls off? Well, the answer is, the more people that know about it, the better, probably. We expect coaches to fill out incident reports. It's just part of the deal. They need to be diligent about keeping accurate records of injuries. But frankly, if someone is taken away in an ambulance or requires some sort of a hospital examination, I want to know. And again, it could be as simple as a quick phone call saying, look, I had a child that fell off or had a real wreck yesterday, or sounds like the child's going to be okay, but we had to call 911 and so on. I want to know. It doesn't mean we're going to necessarily do anything about it, but if it's serious enough, then we will. Lloyd's of London, who's the insuring company on the liability side, has made it very clear to us over all these 20 years that sometimes big claims could have been little claims if they had been dealt with more expediently. So our job is to be a part of that risk management, risk assessment, claims notification process, and we'll do that in a very friendly way, I promise, and we'll try and make the process easy and simple. But early notification does have a direct bearing on outcomes quite often, and so it's important. Okay, another question has come in. All right. Friends come and ride my horse when I am away. Should they be NBEA members, or does mine cover them while I am away? The answer is they should be NBEA members, period. That's an easy one. If you're going to let other folks ride your horse, make them join. It's as simple as that. I can't speak to that enough. It puts some onus on you to make sure that you're managing the risk associated with owning your horse, and it's important that people that are going to be participating in an equine activity see some value in joining the NBEA community, even if it is on a temporary basis. Frankly, given the cost being quite low to join the NBEA and the broad coverage that's there, it makes sense for them to have that coverage. But frankly, by them joining, it actually helps to protect you as the owner of the horse. It will help mitigate a loss. If they have their own accident insurance policy to call upon, if they fall off your horse, they may be much less likely to sue you. And whether I respond to the lawsuit or not, I promise you, no one wants to be sued. There's nothing fun about being sued. There's nothing quick about being sued. It can take months, if not years. It's draining. It's time-consuming. It's expensive. It requires an awful lot of work and attention. And so if you can avoid those sorts of circumstances of being sued by simply encouraging someone to buy a very inexpensive membership, because then frankly it makes entire sense to do that. Should riders be asking to see their coaches at bar as proof of liability? Absolutely. The bar has been raised. The industry, frankly, has changed so dramatically in the last 10 years across Canada and indeed in New Brunswick that there's an expectation now that's considerably different than it was. Business can't be done on a handshake anymore. I wish it could be, but it can't. Businesses can't legitimately offer services without being insured for them. I regret that some still do, but they shouldn't. It's not right. Someday they're going to get their comeuppance, I promise, and the courts will come up, will jump on them. You know, coaches that operate without being certified. I regret to tell coaches all the time, but I was frankly in BC last weekend at an education summit speaking to 60 or 70 coaches out there and reminding them that whether they're certified or not, the courts know that the certification process exists. So that's the measurement that you're being put against if there's a claim made against you. It's not as if you can say, well, I don't have to be certified, so I chose not to. But frankly, that's all the court's going to hear. So that, again, speaks to your lack of desire to be professional. And I wonder how you might think that the courts would see that. People that are offering a service to the unsuspecting general public, which is indeed how the courts see it, have a moral and potentially legal obligation to be trained, to teach, to have horses that are not dangerous, to have tack that is right, to have facilities that are safe, and to be insured. It's as simple as that. This is not coming from some jaded view of wanting to insure all of you. I don't expect to. But I do expect the industry to take responsibility for its own actions. And that does not include, you know, operating under the radar. The business can't continue to operate under the radar. It's, the courts, frankly, are very unhappy with that. You know, anyway, so I go on that all day, and I won't. So should riders be asking for their coaches proof of liability? Absolutely. It's a good way to make sure that your coach or your facility is doing the right thing by protecting not only themselves, but protecting you as a client, so that if there is a serious circumstance, you know you've got recourse. There's a very famous case here in Ontario that led to insurance law being, to the law being changed. Elizabeth Hayter, 12-year-old girl, in fact, not far from this office, at a trail riding facility, uninsured facility, I should say, and who's lost her life as a result of falling off a trail horse that she and her mom had rented for an hour. She unfortunately hit her head and was killed, so no helmet. No facility insurance, no recourse for the parents who actually who lost their daughter. That incident, which occurred in 2000, led to the change in law here, where no minor can ride at a public facility, whether it be a trail riding facility or a riding school or any commercial facility, without wearing a helmet. End of discussion. But having been a part of that process, I can tell you it was horrendous, and that's perhaps the most avoidable death that I can imagine, and because of the circumstances, it was just an irresponsible operator who chose to do business in such a way that he was putting the general public at risk, and that was the outcome. So on that cheery note, I don't see any other questions here. So Carrie, back to you.
Thank you, Mike. If there are no other questions, I think we can call it a night. Thanks everybody for attending. We hope to be posting this on the website sooner rather than later. And stay tuned for future webinars. Thank you very much.
Okay, good night everybody.